Okay, this is chapter 3.2b, and we're in chapter 3 that talks about organic molecules, and we're in the second part of that chapter, which goes into the carbohydrates, and here we're starting with polysaccharides. Okay, poly means many, saccharides, sugars. So, one molecule of a polysaccharide is composed of thousands of individual monosaccharides, usually glucose. So, this polysaccharide is a polymer. Its building blocks are the monosaccharides. The monosaccharides are the monomers. Okay? So, one of our more common examples of polysaccharide is starch. And starch is an energy storage carbohydrate that is produced by plants. Animals have the ability to digest starch, but we do not have the ability to produce it. It's produced by plants. Now there's two forms of starch as far as the technical names are concerned, and those are amylose and amylopectin. I'm not going to worry about the difference between those, but right here, when you see a word that has this prefix AMYL, that refers to starch. For example, there's the enzyme amylase. Amylase is the enzyme that breaks down starch. Now, starch is digestible by humans. Matter of fact, the bulk of the diet in most cultures around the world is starch. And about 60%, about 2/3 of the world's food supply comes from just 3 crops that are grown primarily for their starch. That is corn, wheat, and rice. I recently saw a figure that said that wheat accounts for about 20% of the calories consumed by the human population. Okay. We have another polysaccharide, and a little less common than starch. It's glycogen. Well, less common in the sense that we're less likely to know the word. So glycogen. Now, glyco, whenever you see this term glyco, you think that has something to do with carbohydrates. Okay? So glycogen. Now, glycogen is an energy storage carbohydrate that is produced by animals. Sometimes it's given the nickname animal starch because it acts somewhat like starch acts for the plant. Glycogen does the same thing for us. It's a means of storing up these carbohydrates. So this glycogen is stored in the liver and the skeletal muscle. And what will happen, you sit down, you eat lunch, you eat a baked potato, so you're consuming all the starch digests down to glucose sugar, you absorb that glucose sugar, your blood sugar levels begin to rise. So right after lunch, your blood glucose levels start to rise above 1%. Now remember, we try to maintain glucose in the bloodstream at a level of 1%. So the excess glucose is now converted to glycogen. A few hours after lunch, your glucose levels start to fall, and they fall below 1%. And so the glycogen stored in the liver, as well as skeletal muscle, is now converted back to glucose. And this glucose is then released from the liver into the bloodstream. So this is yet another mechanism for maintaining constant conditions in the body, another mechanism of homeostasis. Okay, we've got another polysaccharide called cellulose. And cellulose is the most abundant organic molecule that we have on Earth because cellulose is the main component of plant cell walls. So, everywhere you look out here in nature where you have soil and moisture, you're going to have plants growing on that in that environment. At least in most of those locations where you have soil and moisture, you'll have plants growing. And in those plants, each cell is surrounded by a cell wall, and that cell wall is predominantly cellulose. So that's what allows this to be the most abundant organic molecule on Earth. And each molecule of cellulose is made up of thousands of glucose units. So sounds like a pretty good deal for us. We've got to maintain glucose at a constant level in the bloodstream. Here's the stuff called cellulose, most abundant organic molecule on Earth. Each molecule of cellulose made up of thousands of units of glucose. Just one little problem: we can't digest it. So you consume a lot of cellulose, but it goes in one end as cellulose. It comes out the other end as cellulose. It is not digested. It is not broken down, at least not by us. But we do need it in the diet. It functions as dietary fiber. And in this role of dietary fiber, cellulose has a strong affinity for water, which means that it's as this fecal material is forming in the large intestines, if you have an abundance of cellulose mixed in with that fecal material, the cellulose absorbs water, and without getting too descriptive, it keeps this material as sort of a semi-solid and just sliding right on through. So the cellulose in our diet, acting as dietary fiber, has a laxative effect. Now, all the cellulose that's produced every year by all these growing plants, we can't digest it, but something has to happen to it. Otherwise, we would be up to our eyeballs in dead tree trunks and dead grass and all kinds of dead plant material. So we can't digest it, but there are a lot of bacteria and other microorganisms that produce the enzyme cellulase, and they can digest the cellulose down to glucose and use that glucose as an energy source, much the way that we get glucose out of starch as an energy source. And also mentioned about microorganisms in ruminants. Okay, ruminants. Well, ruminants are going to be animals such as cattle, goats, sheep, and in these animals the stomach has multiple compartments. That first compartment of the stomach contains a population of microorganisms, and the animal itself cannot digest cellulose, but these microorganisms in the digestive tract of cattle and sheep and goats and such as that can digest the cellulose, break it down to glucose. Microorganisms take up some of that glucose, but that leaves a lot of glucose for the animal to be able to absorb. Okay, so if you decide to go out and just graze, you're not going to put on much weight. Cattle, on the other hand, can go out and graze on that grass and wind up getting some energy from it. Another place where we find this is a lot of another place where we find this ability to digest cellulose is a lot of microorganisms that we find in the soil. For example, the soil in your lawn, soil in forest floor. There's a lot of microorganisms that are able to digest cellulose. Okay, well, this diagram gets a little bit involved, but let's take a look right here at the relationship between starch and glycogen. So this is your digestive tract, sort of, and we've consumed some starch. One molecule of starch made up of thousands of units of glucose. Process of digestion occurs, and we break the starch down to glucose. The glucose is what we can absorb through the small intestines. We cannot absorb the larger molecules. We've got to break it down to its monosaccharides. So this glucose now goes into our bloodstream, and our blood glucose levels start to go up. Okay, some of this glucose that we just absorbed can be used by all types of cells throughout the body for immediate energy. But some of this glucose, particularly if we start to run the blood glucose levels up above 1/10% this excess glucose is going to, we want to maintain that level of glucose in the bloodstream at a constant. So this excess glucose is going to be tied up. So here's this excess blood glucose, and we can, in the skeletal muscle, we can convert that excess glucose to glycogen, or in the liver, we can convert the excess glucose to glycogen. Now then, in both these cases, as blood glucose drops down below 1/10%, we're going to convert the glycogen back to glucose. Now here in the muscle, it's probably going to be used, the glucose probably going to be used right there in the muscle itself. But in the liver, we're going to release this glucose from the hydrolysis of glycogen. We'll release the glucose back into the bloodstream, where this glucose will raise the blood glucose level back up to the desired level of 1/10%, and that glucose can be taken up by cells throughout the body and used as an energy source. Okay, let's look at some other types of carbohydrates. We've got some modified carbohydrates. We've got what's called amino sugars. The name pretty much tells you what's involved here. This is a sugar that has an amino group attached to it. Now we find this in a couple of places. One is cartilage. We have very few structural carbohydrates in the human body. In the cartilage we do have some of these modified carbohydrates, these amino sugars. Another is this material chitin. We don't have chitin. Chitin is a material found in fungal cell walls and in arthropod exoskeletons. Arthropods are going to be things like the insects, spiders, shrimp, crawfish. So pretty much any kind of animal that has an exoskeleton, a large component of that exoskeleton is going to be this material chitin, which is this modified carbohydrate. Okay, other carbohydrates are glycoproteins. So there's the glyco. So that means sugar, and then protein. So obviously it's carbohydrate and protein combined, and we find these glycoproteins present on cell surfaces where they serve as cell recognition proteins, and then also mucus in the respiratory and digestive tract has a large amount of these glycoproteins. Another type of modified carbohydrate is glycolipids. Obviously, carbohydrate plus a lipid. Okay, so that brings us up to lipids, and we'll start with the lipids in another video. Thank you.